The Supreme Court was established by the Constitution and acts as the highest authority in America's justice system. Today, it plays an important role in checks and balances by interpreting the Constitution and deciding if laws violate it. Many Americans today feel this is the court's most important role, and for that, we can thank Chief Justice John Marshall. Right before President John Adams left office, he expanded the judicial system and appointed many Federalist judges to fill those positions. This would have made up for the party's waning influence in elected politics, but many of these so-called midnight appointments were contested and their positions were eliminated. But Adams hit the bullseye when he nominated his Secretary of State, John Marshall, as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Marshall had actually declined an earlier nomination to the court, but he accepted in 1801 and held the position until he died in 1835, longer than anyone else in history. He was a devoted Federalist, so even though the Democratic Republicans ruled the White House and Congress for 24 years, the Marshall Court kept one-party rule in check. He defied President Jefferson by refusing to convict former Vice President Aaron Burr of treason, upholding the independent power of the judicial branch of government. He supported the rights and interests of businesses and agreed with Alexander Hamilton's positions on the economy. But John Marshall's most important legacy is that his decision-making process and landmark rulings fundamentally and permanently changed the court's role in government. In the days of the early Republic, the Supreme Court didn't really have very much authority, but Marshall expanded the court's jurisdiction to make it an integral part of the federal system of checks and balances. First, he elevated the federal government's laws and power over those of the states, giving the Supreme Court authority over every legislature and court in the nation. He also asserted the Supreme Court's authority to exercise judicial review and throw out laws that contradict the Constitution. Together, these roles made the judicial branch equal to the legislative and executive branches. Let's look at some of the Marshall Court's decisions to help you understand its significance. For simplicity, we'll consider some important cases in chronological order. The first and perhaps most significant landmark ruling you need to know about was in the 1803 case of Marbury v. Madison. Remember those judges that President Adams had appointed at the last minute? Well, it was the Secretary of State's job to deliver the warrants to those new judges. At the time, John Marshall was still the Secretary of State, but through an oversight, he didn't deliver a warrant to William Marbury and several other judges. So when Jefferson was inaugurated, he told his new Secretary of State not to issue those warrants at all, and William Marbury took the case to court. Remember, Marshall and Marbury were both Federalists appointed by Adams, and it was kind of Marshall's fault that Marbury was in this predicament. But Marshall knew that if he ordered the executive to deliver those old warrants, and Jefferson just flat out refused to obey, the court would become completely worthless. Instead, the Marshall Court unanimously decided that the judges did have a right to their commissions. However, the law they were using to defend themselves wasn't constitutional, so the court couldn't do what Marbury really wanted, which was demand that the warrants be delivered. In a sense, the Marshall Court limited its own power to act. But in a much broader sense, Marbury v. Madison gave the Supreme Court the power of judicial review, which means they can decide if a law violates the Constitution. If it does, they can overturn the entire law, not just the case at hand. In 1810, the Marshall Court heard the case of Fletcher v. Peck. More than a decade earlier, what had been the state of Georgia had made grants of public land in exchange for bribes to the Yazoo land companies. The corrupt companies then. By the 1816 election, the Democratic Republicans dominated Congress and the presidency. Virginia also dominated the executive office, with all but one of the first 5 presidents having come from that state. James Monroe, a Democratic Republican from Virginia, and the last Revolutionary War veteran elected president, won by a landslide, inheriting the era of good feelings. What happened to the Federalist Party? Clearly, part of their problem was that they'd been on the wrong side of things for a few years, but in other ways, they just weren't needed anymore. Think about it in today's terms, and put aside any cynicism. Suppose a Democrat president, for example, instituted several major policies that had always been part of the Republican platform. And then his or her two successors continued to do the same thing. Would Republican or independent voters be seriously opposed to that? And if people in the president's own party could admit that the policies had been the right decision, wouldn't he or she have most everyone's support? In the early part of the 19th century, the nation had solved its biggest political conflicts. Why did they need two parties at the moment? Both Presidents Jefferson and Madison had taken actions that contradicted the party's commitment to a small federal government in favor of Federalist positions that extended the power of the presidency and the federal government. But many Americans felt that actions like the Louisiana Purchase and the National Bank had indeed benefited the nation. President James Monroe adopted this pragmatic approach to governing. For example, supporting a standing military and promoting industry. And he tried to continue the nation's political unity by appointing people from different regions of the country to government positions. In Monroe's first term, he also increased the nation's borders. Having served as an ambassador, governor, Secretary of State, and Secretary of War, Monroe was an expert negotiator. Soon after taking office, his administration approved the Rush-Bagot Treaty. This agreement between Britain and the United States disarmed the Great Lakes and later gave both nations joint control over the Oregon Territory. This meant that for the first time, American territory reached from sea to shining sea. Then, tensions started to flare at America's southern end between Native Americans and U.S. settlers, as well as military forces passing through Florida. In 1818, General Andrew Jackson invaded, and some of his actions violated international law. This interfered with negotiations already underway to purchase Florida from Spain. But Secretary of State John Quincy Adams knew that Spain was not in a military position to win back the land, since they were fighting several colonial independence movements. And he crafted a carefully written politician's apology. The U.S. government offered to return the captured land, but also blamed Spain for the problems, and suggested that they either learn to control the colony or just give it to America. In the subsequent Adams-Onis Treaty, Spain did just that. All of Florida was ceded to the United States in exchange for the U.S. government acquiring Spanish debts owed to private citizens. The treaty also resolved some border disputes in the Southwest. The nation enjoyed widespread contentment under James Monroe until 1819, when a financial panic hit. Although historians debate the specific causes, it's generally agreed that this was the first recession that originated within the United States and was likely a result of policies established under previous administrations. Still, Monroe was elected without opposition, receiving